Next on the day of demos is a bit of an illustration style, like Irish sweater. We're doing kind of cable knit. I'm riffing on this research image, but not doing exactly, going kind of off of the style I've seen you working with. This felt like it would be useful. So I went ahead and did a lot of sketching for what the textures of this would be, went over it with Micron since there's going to be a lot of layers. It's going to help me see them coming through, and I only want to have to sit down and figure out the math on those once. So I'm doing kind of a base layer here of tinting it with a thin mixture, a very watered down blue with a bit of white in it to create kind of a blue-gray. And I just want everything tinted down that color so that I can build up my lights and build up my darks on top of it. Creates a nice neutral. I'm working on top of a watercolor paper, so it's soaking in a lot, which is why it's taking me a while to fill this in. Then I'm going to go ahead and start spacing in with navy some of my darker shadows while it's wet. I'm going to work a lot of like watery washes, wet on wet for this demo, just because I think it's useful the way that the acrylic kind of blooms and gets a texture when it's wet. Usually we kind of hate it. It's not entirely unuseful when you're doing something like a knit. So I'm then going through with a bit of that with some water while this whole page is still wet and using the bloom of the paper to help me kind of soften it, just dropping in shadows behind and under all of the raised textures of the knit. Using a smaller brush, not being too entirely precise about it. So the illustration style is a little less high contrast and a little less specific about like nailing every tiny detail. It's about giving the impression of these like shapes and the texture of it. So instead we're going to kind of just block these in and really sell that shape and also the texture with this like water blooming. I'm going ahead with a bit of white and starting to bring forward the raised texture. So right now it's going to look really bright when I put it down, and then because there's a bunch of water on the page, it's slowly going to bloom and soften and actually sort of disappear. But it's just a nice start for right now. Along the collar, I'm doing it in little hash marks to show the rib of that. And the weaving, making sure to like leave it where it crosses under so that it keeps a shadow on the underside. This whole like front basket weave thing, I'm just sort of painting in long chains around the circles. And then I'm gonna go ahead and use like a wet wash in the white to just do a couple of blooms along shoulders and areas that are coming forward. So I've let that dry. You can see all that white really did kind of evaporate out. We've barely got anything there. So the first thing I'm going to do now that this is dry is start bringing just a little bit of warmth and more of our local color into it. It's pretty blue right now. So I'm mixing a bit of yellow with a bit of white and slowly kind of brushing it in to areas where I think the sun or the light is going to be coming in. I'm letting it sort of like help to neutralize some of that blue. It's gonna, mixed on top of that, it's gonna go gray out a little bit. Once again, I'm working pretty wet. I'm not using medium or anything. Like I'm using the texture of the bloom of the acrylic to my advantage. And then with a fairly loaded brush, I've got a lot of white on this, but there is a bit of water in it too. I'm gonna once again start building up the 3D aspects of it. It looks real bright. It's okay. When you have water in it, it works more like watercolor where things seem really intense, and then once they dry out, you're like, where did it go? So it's a useful technique sometimes to do it more like that. I like it because it moves a little longer. I get more time working with my brush than I would if I were working with just paint. Even though I have to go over it a few more times for little details like this, I get a more fluid effect if I've got some water in it. But you can already see it evaporating out on that middle section and getting some nice like variation in how much paint is on each section. Yeah, remember how white that collar looked the first time we went over it, so it takes a couple. I'm always trying to keep my brush moving with the direction of the knit, with the direction of the fabric, however it's being pulled, so that that's going to help us encourage our eye to believe that it's being like actually chain stitched or cable knit, right? So I let that section dry, and now I've got a little bit of medium, a little bit of the white. It just helps me get this thickness that I can also kind of pump up. So I don't want it to bloom as much now. I'm hitting more of our bright highlights, and I want them to stay put and not entirely evaporate on me this time. In between the different textures and stitches, I'm doing this sort of just like stippling effect to help sell that like even where it isn't necessarily blatantly cable knit, it's still a sweater, so it still has some like visible texture to it. So we don't want it to feel too like blended and flat. So even in between all the cable knit pieces, I'm doing a bit of like a stippling texture with just a bit of the white with a little bit of medium in it, so it's got translucency, and just sort of blobbing it on there. It's going to dry down, like we talked about. If it looks too stiff, sometimes I blot it with my finger like that, but it's just going to help us like create the effect overall instead of just in the stitched areas. And helps raise our local color more towards that like dove gray of the research image and less in the blue world. Great for shadows. It's not a blue sweater. Now the reason I like using the medium over the water for that stippling effect is that if I did it with water, it would bloom so much I'm not sure you'd see the texture. So with the medium, it's a little bit more, it stays where you put it, doesn't move so much. So that's why I enjoy switching to that for this part of the painting process. Also gonna stipple a little bit and add some of our shadows back in. So here's a bit of medium and that navy. And so I'm gonna kind of bring some of the shadows back in underneath the collar along the sides of things, bumping the 3D effect, and still adding in a little bit of contrasting stippling in areas where like I think it's more in shadow or it's wrapping underneath of a fold, things like that. But it's a pretty low opacity, you can see through it there on my palette. And this is our final result. I painted the background in dark so that we can kind of see the real effect of it. But it's got more of the dove gray feeling. It's got some nice texture. It's very graphically done. It's a little bit more illustration, a little graphic. It's got line work showing through, which I think is fine. And I hope that that helps you complete your final.